You're listening to The Conversation. If you drive on Interstate 10 along the Gulf Coast of the United States through Louisiana and into Texas, you'll see signs everywhere of one of the area's major industries, oil. There are offshore rigs out in the water and refineries right at the shoreline where tankers deposit crude oil extracted from the Gulf floor. But what you might not realise from looking at the surface is that this area is also home to a network of underground salt deposits known as salt domes. And dug down deep inside them are caverns, carved out in the late 1970s, that currently contain 384 million barrels worth of oil. This is the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, America's huge stockpile of oil. Now, as the Strait of Hormuz remains closed due to the Iran war, squeezing global oil supplies, the US is releasing 172 million barrels of its oil stocks in a bid to calm price spikes. The US isn't the only country with reserve oil, but how and why were these oil stockpiles built up in the first place, and what happens if they run dry? I'm Gemma Ware from The Conversation, a news and analysis platform partnering journalists with academics. Welcome to The Conversation Weekly, where experts explain how we ended up here. In this episode, how the world got its oil stockpiles. Scott Montgomery, you've spent 25 years as a petroleum geologist, and now you lecture in international studies at the University of Washington in Seattle, and you write about the global energy industry. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, as we speak, it's been more than 2 months since the Strait of Hormuz has been shut to most international oil tankers because of the Iran war.
The first time in history, Iranian officials say the country has closed the Strait of Hormuz following joint strikes from the U.S. and Israel.
How low are global strategic oil reserves right now?
Well, if we are talking about oil stocks, they are down by about 3 to 4%, which sounds very small, but in fact is the largest in history. And according to the International Energy Agency, if we get down to 5%, then a red light goes off in the sense that these stocks will not be able to supply enough for long enough coverage going into the future to protect from an absolute collapse in supply backup. The coverage right now is about 54 to 56 days. At 50 days, it becomes very serious. There is what is called a September cliff, or precipice is perhaps better to give a sense of the ominous character of it, at which point these oil stocks will not be able to do a significant enough coverage of the missing oil to prevent an absolute surge in prices.
And which country is feeling the pinch the most? Do we know which countries got to the lowest of its stock levels?
These are countries that are not part of the OECD or are not covered by the International Energy Agency, the IEA. The ones who are feeling the greatest strain right now are those in Southeast Asia and Pakistan, and they are in fairly serious straits.
IEA countries have unanimously decided to launch the largest ever release of emergency oil stocks in our agency's history.
So a few days after the US-Israeli-Iran war began on the 11th of March, the International Energy Agency, the IEA, announced that its members would release 400 million barrels of oil. How much oil has the world actually got stockpiled?
The total is about 2.4 billion barrels altogether. And now we are down to about 2.1, 2.2 billion barrels, which still sounds like a great deal. And in normal circumstances, it would be, but is not, what would I say, reassuring.
For someone like me, it's really hard to get my head around what that even is, what it means to release it. When we talk about these oil stocks, what are we actually talking about? What do they look like?
Okay, so if we look at the U.S., they're actually held in a series of salt domes, caverns that were drilled into them in the U.S. Gulf Coast, where there are many dozens of these salt domes. In other countries, they are held in rock formations but in some cases they are in steel tanks as well. So it varies quite a bit. It depends on the local geology.
Let's focus on these salt caverns first. How did the idea of using salt to store oil come about?
It was mostly put in place after the oil crisis of 73 to 74. It took a couple of years to actually work on this and design it, figure out how mechanically to actually create these caverns. And then it began in the late 70s, and most of them were filled partially into the early 1980s. That was a period when the U.S. was making new discoveries in the Rocky Mountain region. It took about 3 to 5 years to create them, and there were a lot of trial and error. A lot was learned. Salt is an impermeable rock, and it is self-sealing below about 1,000 feet. It's plastic under sufficient enough pressure. It's like a hard putty. And that if you put enough pressure on it and the temperature is a little bit elevated and you have patience, it will flow, it will move. And so salt is extremely mobile. We have salt domes because the salt is much less dense than rock is, and it's been able to move up through many thousands of feet, layers of rock to the surface in many cases. But it had been used previously to store various things, and geologically it made sense to make use of that to store a very large volume of fluid. People also recommended granite, but granite is very hard to hollow out, and salt can be hollowed out with nothing more than a large amount of fresh water. And that proved to be the case. And so it was much cheaper and more accessible to use salt domes that were well mapped and characterized in the Gulf Coast. If you want to think of it in terms of an actual shape, you can think of it as an upside-down teardrop. So it has a very beautiful biomorphic shape if you look at it on geologic profiles. Very spectacular. The oil is different in some of the different domes. It's still crude oil, but the majority of it is what we call a heavy sour, which means that it's very thick oil and it has a lot of sulfur in it. And that sounds pretty nasty. And actually, normally, in most of the world, you would prefer something that is lighter than that and has much less sulfur, so would be light and sweet. But most of the refineries in the Gulf Coast that are nearby these caverns are actually configured to take heavier and sour crude. So it's done for that reason.
Have you been to one?
Well, they don't let you on the immediate premises, particularly after 9/11. But I've gone there and been given a tour of one of them when I was working as a scientific journalist for a little while. So I was allowed to at least look at the surface. The surface is not very exciting.
What does it look like?
Well, it basically looks like a bunch of pipes and valves, and then there is a pool of water, brine mostly, nearby that is significant in size, not huge, but otherwise it's, it looks like pipes and valves mainly. Yeah.
How do they monitor it?
So there are wells that are drilled all the way through, and they can put sonar equipment down in there, and then they take a reading of the morphology, the shape of the walls of the entire caverns. And this is very important because the salt moves. And every time you withdraw fluid from it, and then you put fluid back in it, a little bit of the salt dissolves. And so it's actually widening, and that widening lessens the pressure portions of it, and the salt walls actually begin to move inwards.
That doesn't sound good.
No, it doesn't, and it shouldn't. These really have a lifetime, or let's say a safety margin of about 5 cycles of drawing oil out of them and putting oil back.
So you're essentially injecting water in to push the oil out?
Correct. Underneath the oil, because the oil is much less dense than a brine.
Okay.
Yes.
And so that process hollows the cavern out slightly?
Slightly, yes. Each time it's done. So the estimate is at 5 times, that's about the limit. Then it gets a degree of risk that probably is a little too high.
So that just begs the question, have we got to the 5 times yet on any of the US salt caverns?
Well, yes, we have. There are ways to sort of revitalize them or maintain them or to upgrade them a bit, and that's being done. But the geologic reality, and I know that our Secretary of Energy understands this because he is a geologist, that we're going to need new caverns. I should also specify that these are not huge, open, gaping caverns. We haven't hollowed out the salt dome. We actually have 60 separate, smaller, what are called bottles, because they're shaped like bottles. They're about 200 feet in diameter and up to 2,000 feet in vertical length. So they're quite thin, and that's purposeful from keeping the pressure in them more easily. But it means that a fair number of them will have to be replaced. New locations, perhaps in the same salt domes, in some cases in new salt domes. Most of the ones that exist now are in Texas and Louisiana, but there are evidently excellent salt domes that have been characterized for this use in Mississippi as well. So we are actually, in the US, we are actually kind of approaching a period where if we're going to have 120 days of coverage of our imports, because our imports are still pretty high in the US. So a number of decisions have to be made. Are we going to still import oil? And if so, are we going to have 120 days of coverage? And if so, do we still need to have a Strategic Petroleum Reserve this size? And if so, then we're going to have to drill some new bottles.
Are salt domes still kind of the best solution?
Salt seems to be the best. It's the cheapest to actually create these bottles, these caverns, and it's proven technology, and it works very well. So there's not really a reason to search for a completely alternative method.
Are there environmental risks to it or contamination that could happen?
Yes, there are. The real risk is with the brine being somehow spilled at the surface and making its way into surface water. That's very corrosive and toxic. No large-scale spills of that nature that I know of have occurred, and I tried to research that. Didn't find any. There are some minor spills, particularly when they were first being built, but nothing that is of great concern.
Coming up, how the idea of oil stocks emerged in the first place, and what that history can teach us about the long-term possible impacts of the Strait of Hormuz crisis. That's after this short break.
What are you going to have? Can I have 2 pieces of mullet, please? A piece of sea perch and 8 whiting fillets, please, Pauline.
From a fish and chip shop in regional Queensland
I believe we are in danger of being swamped by Asians.
to the heart of Australian politics, this is the unlikely story of the country's most controversial minor party.
Are you xenophobic? Please explain.
For 30 years, One Nation and Pauline Hanson have been ridiculed, dismissed and shut out.
Gone. I don't like it. No, I don't. Never did.
Now, no one's laughing.
One Nation continuing to surge in the polls.
Dramatic surge in support for One Nation.
The fringe becomes the mainstream.
This is the story of how a party built on fear and grievance thrived, died, and rose again to upend Australian politics.
Well, I'm back.
Hanson 2.0 is the serious, strategic, experienced, battle-hardened political operator that we see in the news today.
I'm Ashlyn McGee. This is The Making of One Nation from The Conversation, and you can search for it wherever you listen to podcasts.
Welcome back. Okay, Scott, let's roll back a little bit. When did the idea of oil reserves first emerge?
We should probably go back into the 1910s, and that was the period leading up to World War I. In the immediate aftermath, when basically Western society was shifting from a very strong, almost absolute dependence on coal to one that was a mixture of coal and oil. Particularly in the military, oil had become very important. And so the concern at that point was military. We need oil on tap, or at least we need oil fields that are productive and have been proven productive that we can make use of to produce oil in case of another war or some kind of larger crisis. So the U.S. decided in 1912 to set aside a series of oil field areas with very large production capabilities. Now, there was one in Wyoming known as the Teapot Dome. It became the source of a very famous scandal of the 1920s, the Teapot Dome scandal, when it was decided to have some oil company to lease some of the Teapot Dome acreage to an oil company to develop. And it turned out that one of the cabinet members, Mr. Albert Fall, Secretary of the Interior, decided that he would take charge of this and form his own oil company and direct some of the acres to specific entities that he favored. And he got a significant payoff for doing this, much to his downfall, I should say.
Okay, so this was oil still in the ground, but reserved for military uses. Who started to stockpile oil that had already been drilled?
The first country to really think of building oil stocks, in other words, crude oil that is physically on tap, was France in the 1920s. And by the 1950s, it had created a significant stock that came to be used in the Suez Crisis of 1956. Now, I also need to talk about the Soviet oil stocks. This was a liquid oil stock, was done under Stalin starting in the 1940s in the immediate wake of World War II. This was basically based on a view that the world could destroy itself in the next war, and that the Soviet Union, in order to not only survive but to prevail, needed to set aside fuel, crude oil, food of many different types, minerals, and a number of other goods at a scattered series of places within Russia.
Then there was this one moment in the early 1970s, the oil crisis sparked by the Arab-Israeli War in 1973. That really shifted a number of different countries' views on this. What happened with that?
That was not an embargo-caused event. It was actually caused by the Arab nations of OPEC cutting down their production and their exports. It actually affected the global market. Oil in the post-World War II era was the miracle fuel. By the late 60s, early 70s, it was the majority of our energy use, and we used it for every sector of the economy. And so when this event happened, it affected the entire economy and people's lives from soup to nuts, from dawn till midnight. And so in some countries like Japan, it's not known as an oil crisis. It's called an oil shock because Japan was 70% dependent upon oil alone. So this was a traumatic event, and it was unprecedented. And so it threw the most heavily oil-consuming nations back on their own resources. And fortunately, at that time, there was a great deal of cooperation. The International Energy Agency was formed at that time. One of the key recommendations that it made was that every state that was a member of the IEA, of the OECD, had to have 90 days of coverage. In other words, strategic oil reserves covering at least 90 days of imports. That was later expanded to 120 days, but in the beginning it was 90 days because it was thought that no crisis would last longer than the one that had happened in 73 and early 74, and that was really only about 3 months when the global market was affected. There were other recommendations: better mileage, more efficient cars. Public transport was another major recommendation, which Europe took up and the US did not. And if you look at graphs that show the energy sources that countries were using at the time and how they changed from the early 70s into the 80s, you'll see a tremendous diversification. Natural gas increased, coal also increased, but also nuclear came in at a large scale. And then there were others. There was geothermal actually expanded, and then solar and wind. They also grew at that time until they were summarily degraded under the Reagan-Thatcher viewpoint. And now oil is a much smaller part of our energy consumption, but it is no less important.
What about a country like China? Is it doing something similar to the US?
It has a much larger reserve, much larger. It has put forward a policy since 2022, when we had the last oil crisis. After that, Beijing decided to build up a very large strategic oil stock. And it did. It's about 1.4 billion barrels, which is twice the size of the SPR if it were full. And it hasn't been full for a very long time.
So the US one is 714 million barrels, isn't it, if it was full?
Right, about that. So China protected itself, and it's in a fairly good situation right now.
Is it also using salt caverns?
I don't think so. It does have other rock formations, shale mostly, which has very low permeability, and some shale is practically impermeable for a lot of its storage. And then it has, as the U.S. does, it has commercial stocks, companies that have put aside a lot of oil, and that's almost exclusively in steel tanks.
Let's imagine that the Strait of Hormuz remains essentially shut to most oil for the next few months, and countries really have to draw down even further into their oil stocks. What happens at that point? Can they take them all out? And then what happens if they do? If a country runs out of oil? Practically, what happens?
They would not run out of oil. They would shift. They would adjust because the price would become too high, unaffordable, and people couldn't pay. Well, let's take a good analogy. So in 1973 to 74, prices more than tripled. They went up about 360%. If that happened today, based on prices before the Iran war began, they would now be about $250 a barrel. Gasoline in the U.S. would be $18 to $20, and in the EU, it would be pushing $30. People can't afford that. And many, many industries would have to either go bankrupt or make a change because petroleum fuels would become just unaffordable. That's what would happen. Are we facing that this year? I think that's probably exaggerated, but it would be extremely serious. And nations all over the world would have to make major changes in their oil to lower demand.
Would a country like the US, though, would it at some point even consider draining its whole reserve?
So there is a standing rule that the SPR should not go below about 250 million barrels, that at that point there's too much risk. Now, in a catastrophic situation that would demand more than that, there would be a number of different things that would kick in. You would see oil companies producing a lot more, as much as they can. One thing that is not widely recognized is that there are over 4,000 wells that have been drilled but not completed, perhaps as much as 2 to 3 million barrels a day to our production.
Just in the US?
Yes. There's the capability of rapidly drilling wells. It still takes weeks to drill and complete a month, maybe more. But the U.S. has the capability to produce a significantly more amount of oil than it does now.
Scott, this has been fascinating, and I've learned a lot from our conversation. And thank you so much. It's been really great talking to you.
Oh, it's been my pleasure.
That's it for this week's episode of The Conversation Weekly. This episode was written and produced by me, Gemma Ware, Mend Marawani and Katie Flood, with editing help from Ashlyn McGee. Sound mixing is by Eleanor Brezzi, and our theme music is by Nita Saal. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with a wider audience. If you like what we do, please consider supporting us at donate.theconversation.com. That's donate.theconversation.com. Thanks for listening.
We searched for stories from the remote corners and vast landscapes of the Amazon to the beaches and outback of Australia. And after talking for more than 40 hours to almost 30 scientists and field researchers, we discovered what scientists in the two largest countries in the southern hemisphere are doing to mitigate the effects of climate change.
What I have learned, I learned for life.
I'm Luciana Julião, environmental editor of The Conversation Brazil. Over 5 episodes, our team and I went wide and far to speak with academics from leading research centers and indigenous peoples in Brazil and Australia. We were able to discuss the problems and possible solutions on diverse subjects, such as coastal regions, wildfire, forest management, agriculture, mining, and renewable energy. And we were able to understand what those experts are doing and what can still be done before we reach the point of no return. Voices from the South, Brazil and Australia in the fight against climate change is the first podcast production from The Conversation Brazil, and you can listen to it on our website or on your favorite audio platform. The show is a co-production made by The Conversation Brazil with the support of the Council on Australia-Latin American Relations and strategic consulting from The Conversation Australia. Don't miss it.